we start talking about planting dates, you can see that we move planting dates very early into the season. Typically, we grow group 4s and 5s in Louisiana with a few 3s and 6s, 3s in the sugarcane areas where they want to harvest those soybeans in time to plant cane after that in early August. And then we do have a few producers that still like group 6s, especially after wheat or a late planting type event. But as you can see, we've moved planting to where mid-April is probably fits to all the different groups. But we need to remember that the soil temperature needs to be at least 60 degrees. There's a lot of advantages to early planting, but there are some disadvantages as well, and we'll talk about some of those as we go on. When we look at soil temperatures, I'd encourage you to go to the web and look at the data from previous years. We have a lot of information on the web. All the research stations have weather sites where they keep data on weather temperatures. So you can see at that site when is the average temperature above 60 degrees, at 1 inch or 2 inches. So you can see in different years, you can go back and try to come up with a plan on when we want to plant to reach this temperature. Also, we do a lot of work each year to look at planting dates. Planting dates are very important. As we've seen, there are some differences. We'll talk a little bit about determinants and indeterminates in a minute, and the differences and how that affects planting date. But we do know that if we can plant earlier, then we have higher potential for yield. The problem with planting earlier, in Louisiana, typically we can get a late frost, which will be detrimental to early planting. The thing that you will see that we do have some optimum times where we have our highest yield. If you look at April 15th across all the different varieties, that is one of the best periods at that time. When we look at our group 5s, we're able to plant them a little earlier because they have a little bit longer growing season. So if they get some adverse weather conditions early, they still have the potential to reach their highest yield. The other thing that you can see, if we plant late, we have a lot of producers that, because of planting other crops or other reasons, tend to plant a little bit later. We start to see varieties, the yields start to drop off the later in the season that we get planted. There's a lot of reasons for that. Typically warmer conditions that will affect it. Also the day lengths. We want to capture as much sunlight as possible. If we think about it, the longest day is around June the 21st. If we're planting soybeans the first part of June, then we have a lot of bare ground on those longer days. The soybeans hadn't reached a point where they're going to capture a lot of that sunlight, so we're going to have lower yields. There was a lot of research done over the years, and as you can see, as varieties have changed, so have planting dates. Typically, when we're planting very early in the season, we had varieties that didn't respond well. When we looked at photoperiodism, we had problems with our early varieties because of genetics. They would start to stun if they were planted too early. Typically, in those years, we had to wait till the first part of May to not affect their highest yielding. The problem that we saw then is not the same that we have today. Today's problem has to do with cool temperatures, wet soil conditions, amount of moisture in the soil. All those things would affect getting a stand, and we'll talk about seeding rates and those information on what we found as far as research, as far as seeding rates and conditions that will be favorable for soybean production. We also looked in the 207 and 208. You can see that the yield started with our new varieties started to get earlier and earlier. And this is across all maturity groups. When we took all the varieties and looked at them, you can see that we could plant as early as March the 25th and optimize our yields. If we looked at the different maturity groups, we saw that same information. If we looked at our 5s, you could see that their yields actually were a little bit higher the earlier we were able to plant them. And we continue to see this with our current research. When we look at soybeans across planting dates and maturity groups, The same thing we've seen for several years. We also see this in Arkansas and Mississippi. Our trends follow theirs very closely. If we plant our 3s too early, then we've decreased yields. So we look at planting no earlier than mid-April. But our 5s, if you look at those, the later we planted them, the later or the reduction in yield. So we want to plant them as early as we can in the window. As far as our group 4s, they were a little bit more forgiving, so early April to mid-April was probably the optimum time. But with all of them, as we moved into early May, we saw yields decrease sharply. So we need to realize that we need to plant early to optimize yields.